What if I told you that a simple Wi-Fi signal and a smartphone are doing what no war or revolution ever could, reshaping centuries of Islamic tradition? Absurd? Maybe. But it's happening. Right now. And faster than anyone could have predicted. Whether you're religious or not, this story reveals how technology reshapes everything we thought was untouchable, and why it matters to all of us. I grew up in a household where questioning Islam was unthinkable. Faith held all the answers, until the internet came along. One online conversation turned into a flood of doubts that no sermon could silence. My world was shaken. But it's not just me. Across the globe, centuries-old doctrines are clashing with modern technology, and religious leaders are panicking. So why is the internet Islam's greatest challenge? And what does it mean for the future of faith itself? The answers lie in history, power, and the unstoppable force of technology. Stick around, and I'll show you why this story is bigger than just one religion. Let me take you back to 15th century Europe, a time when the Catholic Church ruled with an iron fist. Back then, the Bible was locked away in Latin, accessible only to priests. Regular people, they just had to trust whatever the church told them. Imagine that level of control, your entire spiritual life filtered through a handful of gatekeepers. And then came Johannes Gutenberg. His invention, the printing press, changed everything. Suddenly, the Bible could be mass-produced in local languages, and for the first time, ordinary people could read it themselves. And guess what they found? Contradictions, corruption, and a lot of things that didn't quite match what they'd been told. Cue Martin Luther, a monk with no chill for the church's shady practices. He wasn't a fan of the church selling indulgences, basically, get-out-of-hell cards for cash. Luther wrote his famous 95 Theses, calling out the church, and thanks to the printing press, his ideas spread like wildfire. This wasn't just a moment, it was a movement. The Protestant Reformation shattered the church's monopoly on spiritual truth. People started interpreting faith for themselves, and the church could no longer control the narrative. But it didn't stop there. This wave of questioning and critical thinking snowballed into the Enlightenment, a time when reason, science, and philosophy took the spotlight. Over the centuries, faith lost its grip as the default way to view the world, and secularism took root. Here's the connection. What the printing press did to Christianity, the internet is now doing to Islam. Think about the rise of #ex-Muslim on social media, or the explosive growth of forums like ex-Muslim on Reddit, where ideas spread faster than any authority can suppress. It's giving people access to information that was once out of reach, and encouraging them to ask the tough questions. And just like the church back then, Islamic authorities are struggling to keep their monopoly intact. Let's dig into how this is playing out in real time. It gets even more interesting. Now, let's talk about why Islam has held out for so long against the kind of shake-ups that rocked Christianity. Unlike the church, which eventually had to adapt, Islamic institutions have historically doubled down on control. For centuries, they've been incredibly effective at maintaining unity and suppressing dissent. How? Through a combination of rigid authority, fear, and a hardline stance against questioning. Over time, this rigid control became a feature, not a bug. Any attempt to innovate or reinterpret Islamic teachings was labeled heresy, often with life-threatening consequences. This level of control worked for centuries. It helped Islam expand across vast empires, keeping practices and beliefs largely uniform. But here's the catch. When you suppress change for that long, the entire system becomes brittle. Any real challenge, whether it's a new idea, a shift in culture, or a disruptive technology, has the potential to break it wide open. And guess what? That's exactly what's happening now. After centuries of control, the internet has thrown the gates wide open, making it easier than ever for people to question what they've been taught. So what does it look like when a belief system built on rigidity meets a platform designed for curiosity? Let's take a closer look. Here's where things get really interesting. For centuries, the control over Islamic teachings was airtight. religious leaders held the keys to interpretation, and questioning wasn't just discouraged, it could cost you your life. But then came the internet, and with it, a whole new world of unfiltered ideas and unrestrained curiosity. Think about it. Before the internet, if you had doubts about Islam, who could you turn to? Maybe your local imam, who'd probably shut you down. But now, you've got Reddit threads, YouTube debates, and entire online communities of ex-Muslims ready to share their stories. Suddenly, no question is off limits. Platforms like the ex-Muslim subreddit or hashtags like #exmuslim on Twitter have become lifelines for people grappling with their faith. These spaces allow people to connect, vent, and discover they're not alone. And that's huge, because for many, leaving Islam isn't just a personal decision, it's a life-altering act that can mean losing family, friends, or even your safety. If this story resonates with you so far, or if you're curious to dive deeper into these ideas, don't forget to hit subscribe. Together, we'll keep asking the questions that matter. But the internet doesn't just create safe spaces, it pokes holes in the narrative. Take TikTok and YouTube, where creators critique Islamic teachings with humor and brutal honesty. Questions like, why did Muhammad ban music but not slavery? Or, how did he ride a flying donkey to heaven? Go viral. These aren't just funny quips, they're starting points for deeper skepticism. And then there's the sheer scale of this movement. According to Pew Research, 24% of Muslims raised in the US end up leaving the faith. In Saudi Arabia, a country where atheism is equated with terrorism, surveys suggest that up to 25% of young people identify as non-religious. These numbers aren't just statistics, they're a sign of a larger shift fueled by the internet. The irony, the same tool that connects Muslims around the world is also connecting their doubts. And for Islamic authorities, this is a nightmare. They've tried to fight back with censorship, blocking websites, arresting critics, and monitoring online activity. But here's the thing about the internet. It doesn't care about borders or bans. VPNs, encrypted chats, and the Streisand effect ensure that once an idea is out there, it's impossible to contain. The result? A faith that once silenced dissent now faces a wave of criticism it can't control. And this is just the beginning. Let's explore how this shift is already eroding the foundation of Islamic authority. For centuries, Islamic leaders maintained control by managing what people could think, say, and do. But the internet is breaking that monopoly, and the cracks are starting to show. Across the globe, a growing number of Muslims are stepping away from the faith, even in places where leaving Islam is punishable by death. In the West, the trend is easier to track. According to studies, for every person who converts to Islam in the US, nearly a quarter of those raised Muslim leave the faith. In Europe, second and third generation Muslims are becoming less religious, with many identifying as spiritual, but not practicing Islam. The children of devout immigrants are often the first to question what their parents accepted as unchangeable truths. Even in highly conservative countries like Saudi Arabia, Iran, and Afghanistan, things are shifting. Surveys show that significant portions of the youth identify as non-religious or are questioning their faith. Think about that. A quarter of young people in Saudi Arabia are questioning Islam in a country where atheism is equated with terrorism. And it's not just private doubts anymore. The internet has made leaving Islam a public, collective act. Ex-Muslim influencers like Ayaan Hirsi Ali and the Apostate Prophet now have platforms that would have been unimaginable a few decades ago. They're normalizing conversations about leaving Islam and openly challenging long-held beliefs. But this isn't just about individual apostasy, it's about a larger cultural shift. Humor, satire, and viral memes are dismantling taboos. Questions like, why did Muhammad marry a 6-year-old? Or, how can the Quran claim to be scientifically accurate when it says the sun sets in a muddy spring? Are no longer whispered in private. They're shared, debated, and laughed at online. For younger Muslims, these questions aren't just jokes, they're eye-openers. When sacred beliefs become memes, they lose their untouchable aura. And as more people ask these questions, the authority of religious leaders erodes further. Islamic institutions are scrambling to respond. Governments in countries like Pakistan and Iran are doubling down on censorship, arresting bloggers and blocking websites. But the harder they try to silence dissent, the louder it becomes. The Streisand effect ensures that every act of censorship only amplifies the message. A banned video spawns thousands of copies. A jailed critic inspires global solidarity. This isn't just a battle for control, it's a turning point. The more the internet chips away at Islamic authority, the harder it becomes for leaders to maintain their grip. And as the foundation of unquestionable authority weakens, the stage is set for even bigger changes ahead. Let's look at why these shifts are happening now and what they mean for the future of Islam. So, why is this happening now? What's fueling this wave of questioning and leaving the faith? It's not just the internet. It's a perfect storm of education, empowerment, and changing demographics. First, let's talk about education. For centuries, the Islamic world discouraged questioning and critical thinking, focusing instead on rote learning of religious texts. But as access to modern education grows, especially for women, things are shifting. Education doesn't just teach facts, it teaches people how to think critically, analyze information, and question authority. And once you start questioning, it's hard to stop. Women, in particular, are driving this change. In many Muslim-majority countries, traditional gender roles have kept women out of the workforce and locked into lives centered on family and faith values. But when women gain access to education and economic opportunities, their worldview expands. Family sizes shrink, fertility rates drop, and the rigid structures of religious life start to loosen. Here's the kicker. Islam's rapid growth isn't driven by conversions. It's almost entirely birth rate driven. Countries like Niger, Somalia, and Afghanistan have some of the highest fertility rates in the world, averaging 4 to 7 children per woman. These same countries also have low education levels and limited opportunities for women. But when Muslims migrate to the West, their birth rates drop within a generation or two, aligning with the national average. Why? Because access to education, contraception, and autonomy fundamentally changes how people live and what they believe. And then there's the internet's role in amplifying these shifts. Online, Muslims aren't just engaging with their local imams. They're interacting with ex-Muslims, historians, scientists, and philosophers. They're exposed to new ideas that challenge their inherited beliefs. Many of them discover contradictions they were told didn't exist, or moral failings in the faith they were taught was perfect. Take modern apologetics as an example. In an effort to make Islam seem more compatible with modern values, some Muslims argue that Islam is feminist, tolerant, and progressive. But here's the irony. In trying to make Islam more palatable, they're reforming it. By downplaying or denying the more rigid and outdated aspects of the religion, they're reshaping it into something entirely different, something that aligns more closely with modern secular values. This paradox is at the heart of why apostasy is rising. The more people are encouraged to question, reinterpret, or justify their faith, the more they begin to see its contradictions. It's not just about rejecting Islam. It's about realizing that they have the tools to think critically and make choices for themselves. The result? A quiet revolution, happening one question at a time. And as this wave of change grows, it's becoming impossible to ignore. But what does this mean for the future of Islam? Over time, doubts turn into debates, and debates turn into action, whether that means leaving the faith, challenging cultural norms, or advocating for reform. This isn't just happening in the West. In places like Iran, young people are shedding their hijabs, defying religious authorities, and openly questioning the faith at great personal risk. In Saudi Arabia, surveys suggest that up to 25% of young people identify as non-religious. These are seismic shifts in countries where questioning Islam was once unthinkable. The power of the internet lies in its accessibility. It connects people across continents. giving them the tools to learn, question, and share. It doesn't just challenge Islam's authority, it dismantles the isolation that kept people silent for centuries. And here's the real kicker. This isn't a movement anyone can stop. Every attempt to suppress it only makes it stronger. Governments can ban platforms and punish dissenters, but they can't turn off curiosity. Once someone starts asking questions, there's no going back. The internet has become Islam's modern kryptonite, and the ripple effects are just beginning. The question now is, what happens next? Let's dive into the future of Islam in a world where questions are unstoppable. So, where does all this lead? The internet has lit a fuse, but what will the explosion look like? If history is any guide, we're looking at a transformation that could fundamentally reshape Islam. But it won't happen overnight. The first possibility is a slow and painful process of reform. Just as Christianity softened over centuries, Islam may evolve into a more flexible and personal belief system. By reshaping the narrative to align with modern values, they're paving the way for a version of Islam that's less rigid and more open to interpretation. But for reform to take root, certain conditions are essential. Free thought and expression must be protected, especially in countries where blasphemy laws are still used to silence dissent. Without the ability to question, criticize, or even mock sacred ideas, progress will stall. The West, too, has a role to play. It must resist the erosion of these freedoms under the guise of cultural sensitivity or hate speech regulations. Then there's the second possibility, a growing wave of secularization. As education spreads and the internet reaches even the most remote corners of the world, the dominance of religious dogma will continue to decline. If this trend accelerates, Islam could follow the same trajectory as Christianity in Europe, becoming one worldview among many rather than the default. But there's also a third, darker path. Hardliners may double down on control, using technology to enforce surveillance and punish dissent. While this might slow the tide, it's unlikely to stop it entirely. The internet's decentralized nature makes it nearly impossible to silence dissent on a global scale. And finally, there's an ironic twist to consider. As modern Muslims reinterpret Islam to fit today's values, they might inadvertently create a version of the faith that's unrecognizable from its traditional form. Over time, this could lead to a soft reformation, not through theological debate, but through gradual shifts in practice and belief. It's poetic in a way. The more people insist that Islam is modern and progressive, the more they change it to make that true. In the end, Islam's greatest challenge isn't external, it's internal. It's the questions being asked by its own followers, amplified by a tool that knows no borders or boundaries. The internet has become the silent force driving a transformation that's impossible to stop, and that transformation is just beginning. Whether it leads to reform, secularization, or something entirely unexpected, one thing is certain. The age of unquestionable authority is over, not just for Islam, but for any institution that fears transparency and truth. This isn't just about religion. It's about the power of technology to empower individuals, foster connection, and inspire change. If you enjoyed this video, please subscribe, give it a thumbs up, and share your thoughts in the comments below. A huge thank you to my Patreon and YouTube members for supporting my work. Your support means everything. If you'd like to join them, hit the join button on YouTube, or check out the Patreon link in the description. As always, thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.